How to Read Poetry Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. Chapter 1, The Sounds of Sense. One of the problems that newcomers, and sometimes not so newcomers, to poetry have is that they believe that they don't know how to read a poem. Is it in your language or not? I don't know how to read a poem in French, but that's because my French is so degraded with disuse that I can't read anything in it. In English, on the other hand, I'm mostly competent, and so are you. Look at it this way. You've been reading in your native language almost your whole life and been hearing and speaking it even longer. A poem is an act of written communication. Like almost all such acts, it is written in sentences. I can't stress this enough. Virtually all poems are written in sentences. Lines, maybe, maybe not. Sentences, almost definitely, which are the basic unit of meaning in the mother tongue. So there is a policy to follow. Read the sentences. Yeah, but those sentences are different, more, poetic. I think what you mean is that they can be more compressed or that the word order is sometimes inverted, which can throw us off. The flow of words can feel different in some poems, especially older ones. That about the size of it? Sure, something like that. Okay, you've just located one thing that makes poetry in English a challenge. The language is fairly flexible in terms of the order in which words can be placed in a sentence. Not like Latin, where the verb always showed up at the end. Still, for a sentence to make sense, that order can't be pushed beyond certain boundaries. Consider the first sentence of this paragraph, for instance. If I rearrange the clause after the colon, I can't, for instance, say, the language is fairly flexible, can be placed in terms of the order in which words in a sentence. To do so is to render it not only meaningless, but also sort of anti-meaning. The verb phrase can be placed wrecks the meaning of fairly flexible, and worse than that, seems falsely to lead into in terms of the order, which only leads to confusion. Not only that, but without them, which words in a sentence becomes a sort of promissory note for a meaning that never occurs. No, those three italicized words have only one possible position, and that is between the two prepositional phrases, in which words can be placed in a sentence. It won't matter whether the sentence occurs in prose or poetry. That word order must be what it is. Words, then, may get slightly rearranged in a poem, but only within limits. So the basic concept remains intact. Read from a capital letter to the first following period, observing all speed limits and signposts. Contained in that edict are 3 rules. Rule 1, read the words. That seems straightforward enough, but it can be tricky, as we shall see. Rule 2, read all the words. The only way to guarantee this one is to read the poem in a way that won't let you skip any words or substitute words not there for those that are. And for most beginning readers of poetry, heck, for most experienced readers too, that means reading the poem aloud. We'll come back to that one. Rule 3, read sentences. I won't deny that this practice is made slightly more difficult when the poem capitalizes the first letter of each line, or when a letter-day poet like W.S. Murren observes both capital letters and punctuation, including periods, relying instead on line length and rhythm for meaning units. Murren is a rarity, if a wondrous one, so we'll dispense with him for the moment. Just know that he is out there. In the other instance, the only real solution is to notice which capital letter matters, the one right after a period, and to do your best to ignore the others that signify nothing but the beginning of a line. So, then having raised the issue of lines, capitalized beginnings or not, I have to give you some incredibly annoying advice. Pretend they're not there. Yeah, I know. That's like going to a basketball game and ignoring the basket. Lines are the most identifiable feature of a poem. In terms of meaning, however, they are rarely helpful and frequently counterproductive. Again, Murren would be one of the rare exceptions. Let's make that rule 4. Ignore lines on first reading. There, that makes things tricky. Read the words, but ignore the lines that contain and organize them. No problem, right? It is imperative that you learn to do so, however, because lines are the enemies of meaning. They make your eyes stop when they end, at least for a moment, as it travels over the gap to the beginning of the next one. Their existence is so pronounced that it seems as if they should mean something on their own, which, once in a while, they do. And sometimes they end with some sort of punctuation, which means if you have a shorter or longer pause, that's what I meant about speed limits and signposts a little bit ago, which leads to Rule 5, obey all punctuation, including its absence. That doesn't seem so hard. I've been doing that ever since I learned to read. I know you have. So tell me why students have so much trouble doing it with poems. I have heard students stop at every line end, blow right through midline periods, completely ignore every comma, and pretty much do anything that is possible to do or not do with the marks and spaces that lie between words. Conceptually, it's a no-brainer, but those darned lines get in the way. So it requires new practice to follow the guideposts that you always have. Pause for commas, pause more for colons, semicolons, and dashes. Stop for question marks, exclamation marks, and of course, periods. And treat every punctuation mark exactly like every other one of its type, no matter where it falls in the line, after line 1, 3, 7, 10, or 22, and let's hope it never comes to that. The really big problem, however, comes not where there are marks, but where there aren't. An unpunctuated line end, called an enjambed line, should be treated as you treat every other punctuated space between words. Keep going. It's the line thing, though. Sure, you have never regarded the space at the end of a line of prose as anything other than what it was. But lines are not structural elements in prose. In poetry, however, they are, and reading through them with some measure of smoothness takes some practice. All of this is leading to something you probably don't want to hear. Rule 6, read the poem aloud. This may be the most important rule of all. Why? Because if you're like most of us, you've never heard enough poems read aloud. Or if you have, they may have been read very badly. Unless you've heard a poem by a practicing poet, which is to say the person who wrote it, that means that you have to learn to hear it by learning to speak it. Poet Robert Pinsky, in The Sounds of Poetry, says that poetry is a vocal, which is to say a bodily art. That is, he explains, that it is meant to be spoken and heard, which involves breath and vocal cords and diaphragms and eardrums, among other bits and pieces of the person. And speaking it and hearing it, we learn to feel poetry. Of course, there is that vibration of the eardrum that gets transmitted to tiny bones of the ear and on across nerves and synapses to the brain, the tightening in the chest or gut, the rising or falling sensation in the stomach, the hairs that stand up on one's arms or the back of the neck, the sense that the top of one's head, as Emily Dickinson said, is being removed. We have bodily as well as emotional or intellectual responses to poetry. That may be an extreme case. Not every poem can have that head blowing up effect. If they all did, we would be forced to give up poetry entirely. But every poem read or heard registers something, even if that thing is only sound. Because sounds, as Mr. Pinsky insists, are not merely auditory but also visceral. And one last rule, read it again. My friends in composition studies have a saying, writing is rewriting. I'm pretty sure one or two of them use it as their meditation mantra. The same is true of literary studies, especially in the case of poetry. Reading is rereading. You haven't begun to grasp a poem until you have read it a second time. This is a problem, naturally, if your poem is Paradise Lost or Leaves of Grass. But I'm willing to bet that's not a customary issue for poetry readers. Shorter is easier. Sonnets are perfect for rereading. Odes slightly harder, and so on. The point is that a first reading is so consumed with just navigating your way through and putting the top of your head back on when it blows off, with just getting from A to Z, that a second pass is mandatory. For best results, I recommend taking a few minutes off between readings. Not enough time to forget this newly discovered territory, only to let it settle in a bit. Go make a cup of tea or build a sandwich. Let the dog out, let the dog in, reread. That's when you'll start making the poem your own. What we're talking about in all of this is the sound of sense, a term I've pilfered from Robert Frost. What he means is that a poem should, and often does, have a certain sound, a combination of rhythm and other oral elements that convey a sense of what is being said. When it's done right, he elaborates, you can discern the general meaning of a conversation from behind a closed door. And remember that he was writing when doors were more solid and more sound-damping than most contemporary doors. Here's his example of a conversation that he invokes to illustrate his point. You mean to tell me that you can't read? I said no such thing. Well, read then. You're not my teacher. We understand what Frost means in large part because he chooses his example so well. We can hear the tone of each of those sentences, the incredulity of the question followed by the defensiveness of, I said no such thing, and the challenge in the injunction to read, which leads to more defensiveness. Further, we understand that if we were overhearing this conversation, even if we wouldn't make out the words, we would nevertheless know what sort of dialogue was taking place. If we want further proof, we only have to read any of his poetic dialogues, where the sound of sense principle is on full display. It is worth observing that this notion of the sound of sense is not inevitable. Frost notes that most prose think institutional documents, among other sorts of lifeless writing, has sense without the sound of sense, while it is possible, as Lewis Carroll proves in the Alice books, to have the sound of sense while producing utter and utterly delightful, in those cases, nonsense. For now, however, we should stick to the main point. Into practice, the sounds of poems. Let's take this idea for a test drive. Here's the beginning of a deceptively simple poem by one of America's great poets. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. That's lovely and maybe a little chilling. It's also Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886, who didn't title her poems, so we know them by their first lines. And what does this first line say? Because I could not stop for death. Sounds like someone is pretty busy, or had been. When death comes to take you for a ride, your level of busyness goes down. His stopping is kind. Good of him, don't you think? And he will be marked by good behavior throughout. The last line brings us up a little short, as the ends of her stanzas often do, for immortality, while not an actual occupant in the carriage, is inevitable in this situation. The following stanza amplifies the statements of the first. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. If we think about the stanza as a statement, we slowly drove, in an explanation. Death always gets where he's going without a rush, and his attentions mean that I was no longer in my former rush. Then we can hear in the flow of words, in the bounce of the meter, the way that the second statement clarifies the first. We should pause here to acknowledge that Dickinson's idiosyncratic punctuation makes our task a little longer. She prefers the dash to the colon, the semicolon, and the period. The poem even ends on a dash stop, rather than a customary full stop. This makes my assertion that we should read from capital letter to period a bit harder, especially when she peppers in all those capitalized nouns all over the place. Even so, we can mostly tell when a statement is ending, even if the ending is approximate. Here's a slightly different angle on poetic diction. This one, the beginning of Kubla Khan, is by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834, and he says, a vision in a dream. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan, a stately pressure-domed decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Read that aloud and listen for the tone. Do you hear the sense of grandeur in that opening? What do you hear? Strangeness, certainly. If you're like me the first time I read it, you have no idea about what either Xanadu or Alph might be, although you may have heard of Kublai Khan, or at least of that other Khan, Genghis. If we can characterize Dickinson's poem as narrative and conversational, this one is incantatory. Just that first line, with its exotic elements and the repetition of sounds, do, did, ku, along with the 3 N sounds and 2 Ks, feels for all the world as if a spell is being cast, which it is, make no mistake about that. The second line emphasizes a magical quality, a stately pleasure-dome decree. Now, it may be within the purview of a con to decree a dome, but what is really magical are the sounds in the line. Pleasure, picking up the L in stately, and the two last words alliterating, and picking up the D sounds from the first line, but then veering away from each other, along with the repeated S of stately pleasure. That sibilance, which simply means the condition of having S sounds, will come at us furiously in the last two lines. Caverns, measureless, sunless, sea. In fact, counting the Z sound of Xanadu, every line has at least one sibilant, hissing sound in it. What we have then is a great deal of repetition of a comparative handful of sounds. S and Z, D and its cousin T, M and in, L, K, and the short A of Xanadu, and man. What also matters in terms of how the poem sounds is where those sounds occur. With the exception of did in line 1, almost every key sound falls on a stressed syllable. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan, and so on. While this emphasis tells us nothing about what the poem means, nor even what we might do with that soundscape, it does begin to convey a feeling. When we find out later in the poem that the speaker is conveying a dream he had, and we see that his language falls into a much more pedestrian profile, when his retelling is interrupted and he loses the thread forever, we can look back on that opening and say, of course it would sound like that. This is the language of dream magic. Did you catch that? In dealing with the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, called scansion, meaning where the stresses fall in lines of poetry, and the study of prosody, the broader study of technical matters involving meter and form, stressed syllables are indicated by an acute accent, while unstressed syllables are indicated by the tiny U, called a breve, over the syllable, accent, together accent, or Xanadu. Just one way of doing it. I tried all caps for stressed syllables, but it felt too much like chatting, and it's ugly. Poems can also be discursive rather than narrative or pictorial. Robert Frost frequently uses this strategy, nowhere to better effect than in Birches, 1916. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straighter dark trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them, but swinging doesn't bend them down as ice storms do. Again, it is important to read this aloud in order to get the effect. In fact, read it several times in different ways, or try to. Just try belting it out as grandly as you can do with Kubla Khan. For that matter, give it a shot as something to be chanted. Know what you'll find out? Not gonna happen. Just about the only way the poem can be read is the way Frost wants you to read it, as one person discussing something with another person. Indeed, this is an intensely personal poem, due to both subject matter and the way the words lead us to this conversational style. If you doubt, here's an experiment for you. Write it out as sentences without line breaks or excess capital letters. You'll find yourself hard-pressed to tell that it ever was a poem. And here is a large part of his genius. The lines are completely regular metrically. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straight or dark trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them. Now, for heaven's sake, don't read it that way. But it remains true that this is the classic metrical form of English verse, iambic pentameter. That means that each line, excluding those where the poet varies the pattern, contains 5 metrical feet, the penta part of the name, with each foot consisting of 2 syllables, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Da-dum. There are plenty of other metrical arrangements, and we'll get to those later on. But one thing we can always count on with Frost is that he will employ one of those patterns. After all, he's the guy who said he'd no more write free verse where there is no regular metrical pattern, than play tennis with the net down. This chapter is called The Sounds of Sense. And so far, we have been talking about how sense occurs in poetry. But sometimes the sounds of sense can be employed in the production of sheer nonsense. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub-jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. You will likely recognize this as the opening of Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, a poem Alice discovers in Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, 1871. Compared to hers, your job is easy. Alice found the poem in the back-to-front world of the looking glass and figured out it had to be held up to a mirror to be read left to right. Not so easy, is it? Be thankful for small favors. What matters for our purpose is that hardly any of the content words, chiefly nouns and subverbs, mean anything in English. That's why Humpty Dumpty has to decode the thing for us afterwards. Slithy, for instance, is a combination of lithe and slimy. And he says, it's like a portmanteau. There are two meanings packed up into one word. That is, in fact, where we get the notion of portmanteau word, which is indispensable to those of us who are James Joyce scholars, or like puns. You may know some words, such as the neologisms, newly created words, galumphing and chortle, but you would not have in 1871. All in all, this was and remains a very strange reading experience. And yet, if we focus not on the content words but on the function words, articles, conjunctions, and so on, this is perfectly well-constructed English in a familiar poetic form. The 4-line stanza is an iambic tetrameter, 8 syllables with the stresses on syllables 2, 4, 6, and 8. In the first 3 lines, and a sometimes irregular iambic trimeter, 6 syllables, emphasis on 2, 4, and 6. In the 4th. Nothing too exotic there. We may have no idea what a jabberwock is, but we have no trouble with beware the jabberwock, my son. In fact, it may make the alien word stranger to have a poetic form and language structure be so familiar. This formula serves writers of nonsense verse, yes, it's a real thing, well from Carroll and Edward Lear to John Lennon and Dr. Seuss, because even nonsense means something. One aspect of most nonsense verse is that it is more regular, at least in establishing a pattern initially, than serious verse. What makes us able to read the nonsense is the regularity. Knowing where words will appear and what part of speech they will likely be makes it possible to predict the meaning of the words that carry none. Consider this couplet from Edward Lear's The Owl and the Pussycat, also 1871, a very good year for silliness. They dined on mince and slices of quince, which they ate with the runcible spoon. You all know runcible spoons, right? No? Neither did Lear. It's a made-up word. He didn't even intend for it to suggest any particular meaning. It has the look of a word, in fact, the look of an adjective, convenient appearing as it does in front of a noun, and it fills out 2 anapests with a runcible spoon. The key to selling a counterfeit word is to make it fit in as if it always belonged in the spot it occupies. In other words, watch how Edward Lear does it. Whether it's sense or nonsense poets speak, we do well to remember that sound is, in and of itself, a structural element in the construction of meaning, and sometimes just plain fun.